Hey, all. I am just driving today, so I thought I would take a couple minutes to share some thoughts about some experiences I've had this last few weeks, months, and longer. But I'm a, I'm a medical power of attorney for a friend who is elderly, and I have shared information about her in the past, just some of the things that we've gone through, and trying to make sure that she gets the care that she needs, which, you know, in a nursing care facility or even at the hospital can be challenging, to say the least. But in recent months, I had been convinced, erroneously convinced, that she was ready for hospice based on circumstances. But once I figured out what was going on, I was quickly able to improve her health situation. Part of that, and then cancel hospice. She didn't need it. But part of that required the placement of a G tube or a PEG tube for nutritional purposes, and that was a bit of a fight to get it done, especially when hospice was involved. If you have any experience with hospice, most of them, I won't say all, but most of them will not work with patients who are on a G tube. And then even those that will, if the patient, should pull the G tube out, which can happen, which I'll get into in a minute. Then, and let's say they pull it out and you want that patient sent over to the hospital to have it reinserted, then they're out. That program, they won't do it. They won't work with the patient. I don't frankly understand that at all. I think that there are some odd limitations within hospice programs, especially when they convey to you that they've expanded their services, that there's a wider array of options with hospice. It's not all just about the upcoming demise of the person in question. And that's how it was sold to me up front. Now I'm with a different one now, and again, I'll get to this, but here's the problem. Here's what I have to say is it's a form of insanity. It doesn't make any sense at all. Now some patients who are cognitively aware, mentally stable, etc., and have a G tube, you don't have the concern that they may try to pull that tube out, right? You've got a perforation, you've got a port going directly into the stomach so that you can deliver nutrients, medicines. And this is what I have done for my friend, and it was working great. However, she has dementia and is oftentimes, obviously very forgetful, and she is quite debilitated by this, and she is in a consistent state of decline. So with all that on the table, the risk for her pulling that G tube out is greater. It's a greater chance that she'll do that. So here's a thought. Can we put some kind of a wrap or some kind of a band around her waist, around her mid-region, to keep that tube covered, to keep that port protected and hopefully somewhat out of reach? Now, believe it or not, the first answer I got was, no, we don't do that. And this again comes back to the disintegrated nature of culture and society, in my humble opinion. And what I'm trying to say there is it just depends on who you're talking to. Are you talking to an individual that really cares, that is in the healthcare arena because they truly want to help people? Are they there for a paycheck? Were they raised by wolves? It's a crapshoot. I don't care if you're walking into the Quick Trip or the hospital. Doesn't matter. Police station, supermarket. You're going to get treatment. You're going to get informational responses based on who that person is. Not based on what the available information actually is. You're going to be dealing with somebody who's in a crappy mood, or, like I say, is just kind of there to collect a paycheck, or perhaps you'll be dealing with a saint. That's possible. And so asking this question, is there some way to put a wrap around the yeah, we don't do that. Well, that just wasn't true in the least. Because by the end of that conversation, I got the same person to say, well, we do have this band that we can put around them. Now, why did that conversation take place in the manner that it did? I got nothing for you. I don't know. It's a total blank up here. I don't know why. But it took me, as it usually does, pushing for information and not accepting no as an answer. Okay, so we got the band put around her midsection so that she would have a harder time getting to this port. Because when a patient has dementia, they're just obviously, cognitively, they aren't there in the sense that they don't know what they're doing. Very, very forgetful. They may feel some discomfort or agitation by this thing, and so they start digging around, right? They start digging around with these, right? Their hands and their fingers. And so a while back, maybe a few decades or more ago, some brilliant mind came up with a solution for this. They're mitts, right? They're white mitts, and they go over the hands, all right? And they buckle around the wrist. And they don't have fingers in them, they just keep the hand inside. And, quite frankly, for some elderly patients, I would think it might even help keep them warm, right? Because their hands can get cold. And so what I wanted was to have these mitts on her hands so that she would not be able to do harm to herself. But, of course, that was an impossible request. They don't do that. The nursing care facility, and it's not unique to them, so I'm not attempting to hold them out as ultimately responsible for the outcomes that we have experienced. But this is a dementia patient with a G tube to keep her, fed and hydrated and medicated as needed. And one would think that that would be something worth protecting, not only with the band, but by placing these mitts over her hands. Now, can these mitts be on 24 hours a day? I would assume no. Can they be on most of the time? To me, I think the answer could be yes. And there are details, right, that take place throughout any given day, whether it's bathing or some other activity, I don't know. And but here's the deal, and this is something that I'm just learning. Sorry. This is just something that I'm learning now, is that Medicare, our government-run healthcare system, it doesn't matter if you're in private practice, it doesn't matter to me at all. Medicare runs the show. If you're accepting insurance, at least. All right? They run everything. They tell you. And their rule is that these handy little mitts are a form of restraint. and so therefore may not be used in certain environments. Now, I've had it explained to me that in part, some of that reasoning has to do with the number of, say, medical staff in conjunction or in ratio to the patient population. So let's say, one nurse for every 2 patients versus 1 nurse for every 7 versus 1 nurse for every 15, right? So in a hospital environment, at least on many types of floors, you might expect 1 nurse for every 2 patients. But in a nursing care facility, especially these days, when it seems to be harder to keep staff on the floor, you might run into 1 nurse for every 15 patients. And so that could potentially leave a patient in a restraint longer than they ought to be. All right, so I ask a question that I think is legitimately asked. What kind of restraint are we talking about? Are we talking about somebody who's tied down to a chair or a bed? Are we talking about somebody who's in a straitjacket? Or are we talking about an individual patient who, based on her circumstances, has these mitts on her hands? Now, this is considered a restraint, and it falls under the same label as the other forms of restraint that I just noted, that I just brought up. I think that's crazy. I think that is a ridiculous way to consider this very helpful restraint. If you want to call it a restraint, call it a restraint. I'll call them mitts that help a patient to not harm herself, right? Now, I wouldn't put those on somebody who is cognitively with it, mentally totally balanced, but just needs a G-tube for a temporary period of time as a bridge, perhaps, to get back to normal levels of health, right? This is just me, Steve the layman, right? Just thinking out loud. Would I put mitts on a person like that? No, of course not. When I move back over to the patient that I'm dealing with who has dementia, would I keep them on 24 hours a day? Probably not. She would probably have to be under some observation, at least out on the floor, in some kind of community setting, with other patients and staff walking around. So there's at least some observation there in case she might attempt to pull the G-tube out. So in the last 2 months since I had the G-tube placed, that started off fantastic. She bounced back. She sounded much better. She was happy in the condition that she's already in. She's in a wheelchair, etc. We went to visit her. Obviously, she still has dementia, so that's still something to deal with, but her overall constitutional health vastly improved, right? She did not need hospice. She needed to be fed. And so, again, I'm just sitting here thinking out loud about why would we not want to protect the circumstances and manage the circumstances on a per patient basis instead of living under the mantle of some universal label called restraints. Well, we can't have restraints. Patients are not allowed to be restrained. And then, I'm sorry, but I have to point out that the front door's locked and they can't get out of the place. Isn't that a restraint? I'm not arguing that it should be there. Heck, I don't even live there, and when I go visit, I can't get out until a staff member lets me out. Isn't that a restraint? But we're not a restraint facility. Okay. I disagree. But as it is, with this simple, helpful device for certain types of patients, what I have learned is that doctors, nurse practitioners, RNs, are not allowed to have the leeway as experts in their field to determine on a per patient basis when a certain minor restraint device might be helpful to protect a person's health, a patient. right? Now, this also applies to bed rails. If you don't know this stuff, you might find this shocking. I did. All right, we're talking about a woman who I couldn't count the number of times that she's fallen out of her bed because they won't raise the bed rails. Now, they're there. The bed rails are there, but they won't raise them. So it kind of begs the question as to what the heck they're for at this point in the game. But knowing where the source of this problem comes from, A, it's Medicare. Why? Okay, well, are there some negative experiences across the board with restraints? I'm sure there are. Should that then preclude a full-on MD, a practicing physician, from being able to make a sound, reasonable decision on a customized basis for a particular patient with particular issues, problems, symptoms, etc.? I say no way. Doc should be in charge of that decision, not Medicare, to determine that all restraints at all times are no longer allowed. Now, let me give you an example of what I mean, because the doctor that I've been dealing with was pretty frustrated by this too. But, everyone draws their permission to breathe in healthcare from Medicare. While I had the patient, my friend, in the hospital because she pulled her G-tube out 2 times, right? She pulled it out the first time. We had her brought in. They put it back in. She then pulled it out again just a few days ago. And then, of course, she was short on nutrients, etc., and hydration. So they put an IV in. She started pulling the IVs out. So what did they do? They put the mitts on. In the hospital, you're allowed to do that. However, they have to take those mitts off a full 24 hours before she's released from the hospital to go back to the nursing care facility. Why? I don't know why. Your guess is as good as mine. I truly think this is one of the more crazy things that I've heard in what is already, just an absolute lunatic asylum for healthcare. The rules, the regs, the this, the that, everything, the things that have obvious negative outcomes for patients. Okay? So I'm visiting her. I can see she's got the mitts on. But 24 hours before she gets taken back to her nursing care facility, they have to take those off. Well, don't you think that means that this dementia patient's probably going to pull her IVs out again? I think that's a legitimate question to ask. So I'm just sharing this information, frustrated as I am about it, about the fact that even though I am her medical power of attorney and I can clearly see what she needs, I cannot get it for her. And so what this has led to now is the second time that she pulled out the G-tube means that the GI doc who placed it is now not going to put it back in again. So she's done. She's not allowed to have a G-tube anymore because she's just going to pull it out again, which I don't disagree with. Of course she's going to pull it out again. What's the chances that she would pull it out if her hands were in a more restrained device? And I'm talking something that is comfortable and warm. This is not like somebody's duct tape her fingers down. This is a mitt. It's a soft, white mitt that her hands stay inside so that she can't be dexterous enough to needle in under the band that's tied around her midriff and then get into that port and pull it out with her fingers, right? I know, I'm crazy. But this is bothering me quite a lot because now this is having a direct impact on her ability to stay alive. And so now, because she can't swallow properly and she has dementia, all of these things are normal. She can no longer have a G-tube to keep her going. So she's going to die now, right? In probably a few short weeks or less. And I'm praying just for a small miracle that God will just take her. So that she won't have to go through the incredible discomfort and torture that is starvation. Now, in my case, I'm instructing all staff involved to continue to feed her orally and to hydrate her with an IV if at all possible. obviously through the mouth as well. Will she aspirate? Probably she will. My options are pretty limited. I can choose to keep her relatively comfortable with some nutrients going orally into her stomach and risk the chance of aspiration, or I can sit there and watch her starve to death, and I'm not willing to do that, and I don't believe that anybody should have to go through that. I think that's wrong. I believe it is wrong. I know it is wrong. But I'm a religious nut, right? Because I believe that there's some moral and ethical backdrop to these types of decisions. And though I've had staff assure me, oh, she won't feel a thing, she won't even know what's happening. I don't believe that for a second. Who would want to take that risk? Would you do that to your own mother? Would you do that to your own family members, your own loved ones, a friend, and just sit there? So now we're going to have to go down this very less than ideal route of feeding her orally as much as we can and hope for the best. But I know it's not going to carry her through. And so she's going to be in a state of deterioration. And now it's just how do we, manage the suffering that comes with that. And frankly, I won't sit here and say that the MITs, are the perfect 100% solution. I'm sure they can also lead to certain failures in outcomes. But I would have to guess, educated guess, that it would be much less likely that a patient would harm themselves the way my friend has harmed herself unwittingly with the mitts on, right? She should be able to live what's left of her life in a way that doesn't end like this, right? I'm not happy at all about this, which is why I'm venting this way. I'm just blown away. I have to tell you, I cannot believe that a bunch of bureaucrats and some massive socialized healthcare scheme are in charge of whether or not a competent doctor can look at a situation and treat it how he or she wants to treat it for the sake of the patient so that they are helped and not harmed. That seems so unreasonable. I'd like to have your comments, so go ahead and write back when you get a chance. Let me know what you think about this. Let me know if you've dealt with it, if you've found other solutions, because I cannot find any. I have looked far and wide for a way to solve this problem for my friend, who is now in a steady and fairly rapid decline as a result of not being able to get a normal level of nutrients and very likely hydration. Something that I have been laser focused on for her for months now, to keep her protected and to keep her as healthy as possible. I'm done. There's nothing I can do. So that's it for now. I appreciate you listening. Thanks.